This is Scott Becker with the Becker Private Equity Business Podcast. Today we're joined by one of the smartest people I ever get to visit with. For his first in his law school class, he's a partner at McGuireWoods, truly a gifted person. We're going to ask him a set of different questions today that I hope will lead some insight to our audience about thinking processes, about how you look at things, how you analyze things today, and a lot more. David, I'll start with the first question. The first question is, in a very overloaded information world, you're a lawyer, you're a sports fan, you're one of the best litigators at a large law firm, do a lot of interesting things, but have a various amount of interest. How do you decide what you're reading, what you're not reading, and how to focus on, not focus on? How do you cipher through all the information sources out there to get what you need and to make sure you're effective and focused at what you do?
It's a really good question, and as you were asking, I was thinking about it. I mean, the answer is I probably could do a better job and could stand to do a better job working through information. But I mean, the short of it is I try and stay up to date on the news. I find TV and getting news to the TV at this point is ineffective. So I tend to look at the Journal or the New York Times for day-to-day news. And honestly, as much as it's toxic in a lot of ways, I spend a lot of time on Twitter/X, not as a news source in and of itself, but frankly because I find the trending topics in the news and sports categories to be interesting, and I can use the feed there to identify articles and information that I actually want to run down and dive into more seriously. So a lot of the time my starting point is serious news sources like, I think two of the more reputable newspapers that still exist in the country in a time when news is becoming increasingly part of an agenda, I think. But with Twitter, oftentimes it's my first touch point with interesting stories or developments. The bridge collapse in Baltimore yesterday being a great example of that, where that's the first I saw of it was scrolling my phone, early in the morning, and then I was able to go from there and look at some more legitimate news sources to actually get some of the real information on what took place as compared to sort of hot takes from random people on the internet.
I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it, how the world's evolved and how you get news, get information in that way compared to 10, 20 years ago, stuff like that. What are you most focused on and excited about this year? I mean, you do a tremendous job of being very close connected to your family and children, your wife and children, your sports interest, you're like one of the finest partners at the law firm. You do those things. I mean, what are you most focused on and excited right now? Like when you wake up in the morning right now, is it a big case you're working on? Is it, both of us happen to be University of Illinois basketball fans? What are you most excited about right now? Is it the Final Four? Is it getting better at litigation? What are you most focused on and excited about currently?
Yeah, I mean, actually, there's like a couple of things interestingly, considering we didn't sort of rehearse this before. There's a couple of things from each of the categories you talked about. So, every day there's a lot going on this year. Family-wise, we have a lot of fun trips. We actually just got back from Disney and Universal. So there's been a lot of things with my family already this year and that are coming up that I'm really excited about. Sports-wise, I am very excited that the Illini are back in the Sweet 16, for the first time in almost 2 decades. And I think we've got the legs to beat Iowa State on Thursday. I'm a little bit more worried about UConn if I look ahead a little bit to the Elite Eight, but certainly been focused there, and I'm hoping that the Bucks also make a decent run in the playoffs. So certainly I'm spending a lot of time looking at basketball teams that I'm passionate about. And work-wise, we have a couple different false claims cases that I'm working on that are relatively new. One in particular is pretty meaty substantively, and there's a lot at stake, but I think ultimately we have some really good facts and evidence on our side as well as strong legal arguments. So I feel really good about our position in the case, but the ability to dig in substantively on meaningful litigation, and particularly where the False Claims Act has so many, there's so many cases that get published on that statute, week to week, frankly, if not more frequently. It's something that I'm really excited about and enjoy that space and enjoy seeing how the law develops.
Thank you. And talk about when you deal with different leaders at clients. What do you admire in leaders that you work with? When you see leaders doing things right, or managing their law firms well, working with their law firms well, what do you admire in clients that are leaders?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is the manner in which they interact, both internally and with outside counsel. And I find the folks that are most effective at that are those who recognize that there's a team-based element to it. And that doesn't mean that there's not a hierarchy, and certainly in a client-attorney relationship, the client ultimately gets to make the decisions and ultimately controls the relationship. I ultimately work for my clients, and that's very much what my role is. But I think the folks who are really effective are very collaborative, and they're looking for advice. They're going to push back on the advice, but in a respectful way, and challenge the thinking. But they recognize that they're spending, a lot of the client's money on getting counsel and having lawyers who are intelligent and can work through and advise on problems, and then they're going to test that and work with it. But doing so in a respectful manner and recognizing that it's part of a broader team, I think is incredibly helpful. And then similarly, I think those same folks tend to have that for their internal correspondence as well, and they tend to treat their colleagues, whether it's subordinates or others at upper levels of the entity, on a as being part of the team and on a level playing field. And again, that doesn't mean the buck always stops somewhere. Someone's got to be the actual decision maker and have the final say. But that doesn't mean that there can't be a healthy respect and a good dialogue in the meantime as well, where everybody feels well supported within the team structure.
And another question. We have Coach Bill Belichick speaking soon together with President Bush and Michael Strahan and Martha Stewart at our Becker's Healthcare annual meeting in a couple of weeks. Is Bill Belichick unhireable at this point, or will he be hired by somebody? And what's the situation there? Did he mess up by not continuing to ride Tom Brady for the rest of his career? What's the situation with Bill Belichick? Is he unhireable at this point, or wants too much to be GM and coach? Nobody wants him for both roles?
I think it's the latter and not the former. I don't think he's unhireable. I think if there's one thing the NFL has shown over and over again, there's no end of second and third and fourth and eighth chances to coaches who had success at one point in the past and who haven't had major personal strife or issues. Like John Gruden may find it harder to get another job due to some of the concerns that were raised, but Bill Belichick's were more performance and timing in New England. So I don't think he's unhireable. I'd be shocked if he doesn't end up getting another chance somewhere. But I do think, the amount of control that he wants relative to the last couple of seasons where the team has frankly just not been good, and where they thought they had a team that could at least compete for a playoff spot, combining that with the issues at the quarterback position post-Brady, and the fact that, frankly, his track record prior to joining the Patriots as a head coach was not particularly strong. I think there are some who would whisper and question whether or not he was as much a product of Tom Brady or as Brady was of him, particularly where Brady won a Super Bowl in Tampa. So I think he'll get another chance, but I think he's going to have a realistic appraisal of the value that he brings to another team in terms of what he's asking for comp-wise, and more importantly, from a control standpoint, because I don't think he's a coach and general manager all-in-one package that teams are going to race to be giving, the whole world to right now. And I think he has to recognize where the market is.
No, I think it's a fascinating perspective. I think that's exactly right. Let me ask you this question. So X or Twitter, despite all the ramblings, remains incredibly popular. What is the deal with Trump Social? Who's on that platform? Is it a platform like Twitter? I mean, I know it just made former President Trump rich again, but what is Trump Social? Have you followed this at all?
It's interesting. I've never used it, and I could not tell you with a straight face that I know anyone who's used it. But I also just wonder if some of that is the fact that people have such a visceral reaction good or bad, by the way, to all things Donald Trump, that a lot of people just don't bring it up, because I sort of liken it to 2016, where not many people were out there. I mean, there were some very vocal Donald Trump supporters, obviously, but there were lots of people who clearly ended up voting for him in 2016 that weren't necessarily advertising that, at least based on polls. And I wonder if that's sort of the same thing that's happening with Truth Social, where it's people are looking at it and not actively discussing it, but clearly there's some level of a user base. But beyond that, I just don't know. It's not a platform I've used. And again, for what I use Twitter for, which is largely being sometimes it's entertainment and, chatting or making posts about the Illini, things of that nature. But oftentimes, it's just seeing what is trending and what's out there, and then using those trends to identify real information. I don't see Truth Social as a viable alternative for my purposes right now in terms of how I use Twitter X, but clearly some do.
But let me ask you a question. I guess I'm looking this up now. It's not just called Trump Social. It's called Trump Truth Social. So there must be an expectation that one is going to get clear and good news on it.
Sure. I mean, I think that is the general concept. Is it's an uncensored, unvarnished news source, but I think that's also what Twitter builds itself as, and I think unvarnished news sources are harder and harder to find these days.
Yeah, no, I say that facetiously, and I just so it's clear to people on the podcast, I'm not pro Biden or pro Trump. I think both. It amazes me that these are two candidates. Oh my goodness, I think just both are just awful choices. It is what it is. I don't mean to be poking fun at one versus the other, but it's almost like it's we tease my children that Fox is a good thing to watch because it's fair and balanced, which is back in the day was their tagline for those that are my age and don't remember that, but they called it fair and balanced, like Trump calls it Truth Social, so it must be true. In any event, David, always great to visit with you. I think this concept of focus, and where does one focus? What does one read, not read? Where do they keep their mind from wandering? How do they stay at it? You've done a great job of that. You don't become valedictorian and as brilliant as you are and perform day in, day out as well as you do without staying focused. And it's a marvelous skill in today's over information overload world. Again, David Pivnick, partner at McGuireWoods, brilliant lawyer. Thank you for joining us on the Becker's Private Equity Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Scott.